When my mother first introduced me to her new boyfriend, Mark, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. It had been a few years since my parents' divorce, and I wanted my mom to find happiness again. She deserved it after all the pain she had been through. Mark seemed charming and charismatic, with a warm smile and a seemingly genuine interest in getting to know me. At first, everything was a whirlwind of positive experiences. We went on outings as a new family, sharing laughs and creating memories. Mark had a way of making my mom laugh that I hadn't seen in years, and for that, I was grateful. He was considerate toward me as well, asking about my interests and engaging in conversations that made me feel valued. As time went on, though, I began to notice small signs that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Mark would occasionally make comments that left me slightly uncomfortable, like subtly criticizing the way I dressed or the books I liked to read. I brushed them off, thinking it was just his way of teasing, of trying to fit into our lives. Looking back, I remember how he would sometimes undermine my accomplishments, comparing them to what he considered more significant achievements. But back then, I thought he was just sharing stories from his own life. It wasn't until later that I realized he was belittling my successes, trying to establish his dominance. In those early days, my mom was swept up in the excitement of her new relationship. I didn't want to be the one to rain on her parade, so I kept my concerns to myself. I told myself that I was just being overly sensitive, that Mark was just adjusting to his new role in our lives. Little did I know that these were the first inklings of a much darker reality that would unfold over the next few years. As the initial excitement of my mother's new relationship began to settle, I couldn't ignore the fact that Mark's behavior was changing. The once charming comments he made now had a subtle bite to them, and it wasn't long before I started feeling the sting of his insults. It started innocently enough, a passing comment about my choice of hairstyle or a light-hearted joke about my taste in music. At first, I laughed along, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. After all, he was my mom's boyfriend, and I didn't want to rock the boat. But the insults didn't stay lighthearted for long. They escalated in frequency and intensity, targeting my appearance, my hobbies, and even my intelligence. I remember the sinking feeling in my chest each time he made a hurtful remark, as if a little piece of my self-esteem was being chipped away with every word. What hurt the most was that my mom seemed oblivious to these comments. She was so caught up in her relationship that she didn't notice the subtle shifts in Mark's behavior. I wanted to believe that she wouldn't stand for anyone treating me poorly, but her lack of intervention left me feeling like I was on my own. As the insults became more frequent, they started to affect how I saw myself. I began to doubt my choices, questioning whether my interests were worthwhile or if my appearance was truly as flawed as Mark suggested. I felt a constant need to prove myself, to seek validation from others, because Mark's words had chipped away at my self-confidence. At first, the changes were subtle. Mark would suggest that spending time with my friends was a waste, that they weren't truly supportive of me. He'd imply that they were just using me, or that they were just using me, or that they didn't really care about my well-being. Slowly but surely, I started distancing myself from the friends who had always been there for me. As the isolation deepened, Mark extended his influence to my relationship with other family members. He'd find ways to create tension or misunderstandings between me and my extended family, making me feel like an outsider, even among those I had once felt close to. I felt like I was losing my support system, and the loneliness began to take its toll. My mother, caught up in the whirlwind of her new relationship, didn't notice the subtle ways in which Mark was pulling me away from the people who cared about me. I tried to express my concerns to her, but she brushed them off as teenage drama or simply my resistance to accepting her happiness. With each step, Mark's hold on me grew stronger. He became my primary source of companionship, manipulating my need for connection and replacing it with a toxic dependency on him. I felt trapped, like there was no one left to turn to who would understand what I was going through. The more isolated I became, the more power he had over me. As Mark's manipulation tactics grew more sophisticated, he introduced a particularly insidious weapon into his arsenal: gaslighting. It was as if he had been studying me, learning my vulnerabilities, and was now using that knowledge to warp my perception of reality. The gaslighting began with subtle contradictions. He'd make hurtful remarks, and then later deny ever saying them. It was confusing and disorienting. I started questioning my own memory and sanity. Did he really say that? Maybe I misunderstood. This internal struggle played right into his hands? Mark's gaslighting techniques evolved over time. He'd start a conversation with one tone and end it with another, making me doubt my recollection of events. He'd twist situations to make himself look like the victim, leaving me feeling guilty and responsible for things I knew weren't my fault. It was as if he had a playbook for manipulation and was executing it with chilling precision. The more he gaslit me, the more isolated I felt. It was like he was erasing my reality and replacing it with his version of events. I was losing my grip on what was true and what wasn't. Every time I confronted him about something hurtful he had said, he'd look at me with a mixture of pity and concern, telling me that my emotions were getting the best of me. My mother's blind trust in Mark only added to my confusion. Whenever I tried to express my concerns to her, she'd defend him vehemently, convinced that he could do no wrong. I felt like I was spiraling, caught in a web of deceit that I couldn't escape. The gaslighting was a relentless attack on my self-esteem, and I found myself questioning my own judgment at every turn. In this chapter of my story, the heartbreak deepened as I grappled with the reality that my mother's trust in Mark was unwavering, even in the face of his emotional abuse. It was a painful lesson in the power of manipulation and the complexities of human relationships. No matter how much evidence I had of Mark's hurtful behavior, my mother continued to defend him. She seemed blinded by his charm, unable or unwilling to see the pain he was causing me. Whenever I tried to share my feelings with her, she'd dismiss my concerns, chalking them up to my teenage emotions or my resistance to her happiness. It hurt to realize that the person who was supposed to protect me, support me, and believe in me was siding with my tormentor. I felt betrayed and abandoned, as if the one person I should be able to turn to was slipping away. Mark's manipulation had successfully driven a wedge between me and my mother, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. As my mother's trust in Mark grew, so did my isolation. I felt like an outsider in my own home, like I was living in a reality that only I could see. Mark's gaslighting had effectively skewed my mother's perception, making it nearly impossible for her to see the truth. I began to realize that I couldn't rely on my mother to save me from this situation. I had to find my own way out, even if it meant facing the unknown without her support. It was a painful realization, but it also marked the beginning of my journey towards self-empowerment. In this chapter of my story, the emotional abuse I had endured took a more overt and public turn. Mark's tactics evolved from subtle insults and gaslighting to outright belittlement and manipulation, leaving me feeling exposed and humiliated. Mark seemed to relish in finding new ways to undermine me, especially when others were present. He would mock my interests, belittle my achievements, and twist my words to make me seem foolish. It was as if he had a personal vendetta against my self-esteem, and he was determined to crush it completely. One of his favorite tactics was provoking me into reactions. He'd push my buttons until I reacted with frustration or anger, and then he'd play the victim card, acting as if I was the one causing problems. This manipulation left me feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. I began to doubt my own perceptions, wondering if maybe I was overreacting or misinterpreting his actions. Mark's public humiliation didn't stop with me. He'd make hurtful comments about me to my mother's friends, extended family members, and even our neighbors. It was a calculated attempt to isolate me further, to ensure that I had no one left to turn to for support. I felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, with no escape in sight. Yet even in the midst of this darkness, a spark of defiance began to flicker within me. The more Mark tried to break me down, the more I realized that I couldn't continue to let him control my narrative. It was a slow and painful realization, but it marked the beginning of a shift in my mindset. A shift from being a passive victim to someone who was determined to fight back, even if the battle seemed impossible. After enduring years of emotional abuse and manipulation, I finally mustered the courage to sit down with my mother and share my side of the story. I poured out my feelings, recounting the hurtful comments, the isolation, and the public humiliation. I hoped that by opening up to her, she would see the truth and stand up for me against Mark's abuse. But what transpired was beyond heartbreaking. My mother's reaction wasn't what I had hoped for. Instead of acknowledging my pain, she accused me of trying to sabotage her relationship. She defended Mark vehemently, claiming that I was being overly sensitive or even fabricating stories to undermine their happiness. In that moment, I felt utterly defeated. It was as if the last bit of hope I'd clung to had been extinguished. The person who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to be my advocate, had chosen to side with my advocate, had chosen to side with my abuser. The weight of that betrayal was crushing. As I retreated to my room, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. It was a turning point, a moment when I realized that I couldn't rely on my mother to rescue me from this situation. I had to find a way to break free on my own, even if it meant walking away from the one person I'd always counted on. With the heartbreaking realization that my mother wouldn't be my ally, I knew that I had to take matters into my own hands. I began by seeking solace in places where I could be myself and feel supported. I opened up to a school counselor who provided a safe space for me to share my experiences. Through our conversations, I learned about the dynamics of emotional abuse and realized that I wasn't alone in my struggle. I also started documenting the instances of abuse, keeping a journal of hurtful comments, manipulative actions, and accounts of gaslighting. This record-keeping served two purposes. It validated my experiences and provided me with a tangible record of what I was enduring. It was a way to anchor my reality and fight against the doubt that Mark's manipulation had sown. In the midst of this darkness, I found solace in the friendships that had endured despite Mark's attempts to isolate me. My true friends saw through his tactics and provided unwavering support. They reminded me of who I was before his influence, helping me rebuild the shattered pieces of my self-esteem. With time, I gained a deeper understanding of emotional manipulation and the power dynamics at play. I started to recognize the patterns of abuse and developed strategies to counteract them. Slowly but surely, I began to stand up for myself, asserting my boundaries and refusing to be a victim any longer. In this chapter, I found my voice again, a voice that had been silenced by Mark's cruelty. I discovered the strength within me to challenge his toxic influence and take back control over my life. It was a period of gradual empowerment, marked by moments of defiance and self-affirmation.